It's important to take the Russians seriously, to accept that they have a foreign policy doctrine, which they do, but also to accept that they're very good at confusing us about exactly what they're up to. Certainly their foreign policy is directed against Ukraine as a stable and successful state. What I think is less often noticed is that this is part of a broader policy aimed at destabilizing the European Union. Because Russia is technologically and demographically weak, the only way for Russia to become a great power is for the European Union and the transatlantic relationship to fall apart. The reason why they like to talk about the Americans is that talking about NATO, talking about the Americans, helps inside the European Union, because then the Europeans can say, aha, the Maidan, Ukraine, that's the Americans' fault, or that's the Americans' responsibility. But I think the conflict now, since 2013, in Russian foreign policy, the main concern has not really been NATO. The main concern has been the European Union.
But what is the European Union answer on that? Do they think they understand, and the different people in Paris, Berlin, and London have an idea about that?
Yeah, it's a terribly interesting moment, because Russian elites have come to a kind of clarity about what they want in the world. They want to have a competing vision of civilization. They want the European Union to be weaker. Whereas European elites are living in a world that they themselves did not make. They're living in a world that they inherited from the previous generations. And they take so much for granted, like the European Union itself. The idea that the European Union could have an enemy, or that the European Union could fall apart, is very difficult for people to think. And yet it does have an enemy, and it could fall apart.
Well, that seems interesting, because before this conflict, I mean, you're talking about how Russia saw the EU as, at the very least, a competitor, and possibly a foe to be rivaled with. But it seems like one of the results of this conflict is that many European leaders and countries have started to see Russia in the role of a foe, where they hadn't seen that before. They focus more on opportunities to work together.
Right. I'm not saying this foreign policy has a big success. I'm saying that it is coherent, and we have to take it seriously. I completely agree with you. The objective outcome of Russian foreign policy has been to accelerate a trend in which Russia becomes a junior partner of China. Right? If we look at this, if we look at the Maidan, the revolution, the counter-revolution, the war, from a global perspective, the very significant thing is that China is the winner. Right? China still has good relations with Ukraine. China is in a much stronger position vis-a-vis Russia. China has much more room for maneuver in general as the Americans fall back. So China is winning, and China is trying to be very quiet about winning. And Russia is trying to be very quiet about the fact that in losing the West, it's tilting its whole population towards China. If Putin had to say, the result of my foreign policy is that we're no longer going to be like the West, we're going to be more like China, that wouldn't be very popular. So he's trying very hard not to say that, but that's what's happening.
But when you say that Russia has a thought-out foreign policy, even if it's not successful, is there room in that policy and that understanding for Ukraine as it is? Is that something that can be negotiated with, or not?
No, good question, no. Okay. There is not room for Ukraine as a stable state with a European orientation. For Russia's policy towards Ukraine to change, Russia's policy towards the European Union would have to change. That's what I mean when I say it's all one thing. Russian policy could change. I mean, I think it would be wise if it did. I think ultimately the future of Russia is with Europe or the West in some broad sense. That's where Russian trade goes. That's where Russian intellectual history comes from. That's where Russians like to travel. Despite, contemporary disagreements, that would be the natural orientation. And they could shift back that way. All I'm saying is that they can't really change policy towards Ukraine without changing the overall policy towards Europe.